So a couple years ago, I did a bunch of top 10 lists on the channel. I've always been the guy that likes lists. I like making lists. I like to-do lists where I get to check things off the list. Anyway, I like lists, and so does the YouTube algorithm, frankly, because a lot of those videos did really, really well. I did my favorite authors, my favorite book series, and then I did a bunch of like subcategories. I did my favorite classics, historical fiction, science fiction, so I explored a lot of the genres. But I never explored my favorite genre, the fantasy genre. So I guess it's time to right that wrong. So here is my top 10 fantasy series. All right, before we get started, quick disclaimer. Some of you are not going to like number 10. Just skip ahead if you don't want to hear me talk about number 10. But I do have two honorable mentions. I don't normally do honorable mentions, but for this video, I had to come up with a little bit of structure, at least some rules. And there are two series that I conceive in my head as top 10 favorites. But when I imposed the rules upon this list, they got left out. So my first rule is that if an author is still writing the series, that I can't include them on this list. So because of that, eliminated from my top 10 is The Dresden Files by Jim Butcher. This is an urban fantasy series. I think there's 18 or 19 books at this point, and it's a series that started slow for me, but man, the last half of this series has been absolutely incredible. It is destined to be on the top 10 list. So whenever Butcher's done with the series, I think he's going to do 24, 25. It'll be on this list. But until then, it's going to be sitting on the honorable mention list. And the other rule is if I'm not done with a series, so I'm reading a series and I love it and I think it's a top 10, but I haven't gotten to the end, I feel that endings are important, so that may raise or lower the esteem for a series for me. So because of that, there is one series that in my mind is a clear-cut top 10 favorite of mine, but I'm not done yet. I'm only 8 books into this 10-book series, and that's Malazan Book of the Fallen by Steven Erikson. I'm pretty sure this is destined to be in the top 10, maybe even top 5, depending on how it ends, because the highs in this series are incredible. Malazan Book of the Fallen is epic with a capital E, and it is one of the most remarkable feats of storytelling I've encountered. And I'm really enjoying it, and it's going to be a top 10, but not right now. So for now, it is on the honorable mention list. All right, on to the proper top 10. Number 10, The Belgariad by David Eddings. Now, don't click away. A little disclaimer. There's a little bit of nostalgia for me in this pick. This is a series that I loved when I first read it as a 14-year-old, but I did reread it a few years ago, and I think it still holds up. But this is not fantasy for the seasoned fantasy reader, at least as I'm filming this in 2026. When it came out, which was 1982, checking my notes, came out in 1982, and at the time, a lot of what's being published was in the Tolkien vein. I won't call him a Tolkien clone. I think that's a little bit insulting, but you can say that Eddings was formulaic because he did indeed publish his formula later in life. And this is not for modern fantasy readers because it has all the tropes. You name a fantasy trope, the Belgariad probably has it. So if you like your orphan farm boy chosen one trope, you got it. You got a Dark Lord, you got an old wizened wizard, you have a fellowship trope, you have a quest trope, you have magical items, you have magic users. I mean, you name it, you name a fantasy trope, and it's probably in that 5-book series, The Belgariad. Again, it was published in 1982. The first book is called Pawn of Prophecy, and even though this does have a little bit of a nostalgic pick for me, there are other authors that were wrote in this vein at the time. I mean, I would say the Dragonlance books, I would say Terry Brooks, and a lot of others that aren't in this top 10 list, but Eddings is still there. Maybe not for long because of my honorable mentions, but I still love the Belgariad. I still think that some of the characters are of the most interesting and memorable that I've read in the fantasy genre, but it's not for the seasoned fantasy reader of the 21st century. But if you haven't read the fantasy genre, I can think of no better entry point than reading the Belgariad because it's going to introduce you to all the tropes that modern fantasy authors are most likely going to subvert. Can you hear the rain? Good ambiance, I guess. Number 9, The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan and completed by Brandon Sanderson. Wheel of Time was published between 1990 and 2005, and it is the longest book series that I've read. if you consider it just one complete book series. There's another one on here that's some interconnected book series, but The Wheel of Time is 14 novels plus a novella. Jordan wrote the first 11 and the novella, and then he passed away, and then Brandon Sanderson finished the series admirably with the final 3 books. Wheel of Time is many things, but epic is definitely one of them. Another thing that people talk about the Wheel of Time is it's kind of a bridge series between traditional kind of Tolkien-esque fantasy and more modern fantasy. And that's one of the things I really liked about it when I read it for the first time, which was only about 6 years ago. When I read it, what impressed upon me is it started off in the vein of what I knew. We had basically the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring with different kinds of characters, but then Jordan went his own way. You see a greater representation of female characters. You see female characters with a lot more agency and a lot more depth. And this series, above all, has some of the finest character arcs I've read in the genre. Now, granted, over the span of 14 books, you can do a lot with character, but that doesn't change the fact that Jordan does a masterful job in just developing some of these characters and giving them these long-term storylines that will just stick with you. Now, there are things you can criticize about this series. There's the dreaded slog in the middle, some of the books where the plot slows down as Jordan does some other things. The series as a whole is pretty long. Jordan's writing tends to be a bit repetitive, but I'll be honest, when Sanderson took over, I missed Jordan's writing style quite a bit at that point in the series. But Sanderson did a great job finishing the series, and it remains one of my favorite series of all time. Wheel of Time, it's not for the faint of heart. I mean, 14 big, chunky books, but I felt that it was worth it, and it's a series that I continue to hold in high esteem the more I think about it. Number 8 is the Empire Trilogy by Raymond E. Feist and Janny Wurts. Empire Trilogy was published between 1987 and 1992 and is set kind of in the world of Feist's Rift War. Feist wrote his Rift War saga, which was 4 books or 3 books if you combine the 2 Magician books together. And then there's this series that takes place on the other side of the rift, in this other world. And the thing that I can say unequivocally at this point, I've read, I think, 15 of the Rift War cycle books. There's a saga and a cycle. That's a different video. But I've read 15 of these books so far, and the collaboration between Feist and Wurts is clearly a cut above all of them. And I was just so impressed with this series. This was a series that I read 3 or 4 years ago, and I kind of kicked myself for missing it when it came out, because I did read Feist when he came out with the Rift War saga, and I'm kind of sad that I took so long to get to this series, but I'm so glad that I did. The Empire Trilogy is set in an Eastern-inspired world. The world-building elements are top-notch. You get a very strong female protagonist who you will connect with right away. And in the first book, you get some of the best political fantasy I've read anywhere, where you get this character who's kind of a fish out of water, and she's just using her wits to try to survive this game of noble houses that she finds herself embroiled in. And it's a fantastic series. The 3 books span basically this woman's life and goes through a lot of trials and tribulations, but I loved all 3 books, and I think it's a series that frankly is slept upon a little bit in 2026, but if you haven't read the Empire Trilogy, I would definitely implore you to do so. And you don't have to necessarily have read the Rift War saga. I love the Rift War saga. I will read the entire cycle over the next few years, and there are a couple scenes in here that play out that you saw in the Rift War saga that you get a different perspective in the Empire Trilogy, but you could 100% read it as a standalone. So if you're not interested in that big series and you just want to read this series, you can jump right in, and I would guess that you're going to have a fantastic time reading the Empire Trilogy by Raymond E. Feist and Janny Wurts. Number 7 is The Long Price Quartet by Daniel Abraham. This is the newest entry for me onto this list, as I just read this last year. This was published between 2006 and 2009. It is 4 books, and it is non-epic fantasy, but it's non-epic fantasy with a level of world building and especially of culture that is just as good as the big epic tomes that we're used to reading in this genre. Daniel Abraham does a really remarkable job in this series in introducing you to two boys in this first book, and over the 4 books, because of time jumps of 10 to 15 years between books, you get to see them at 4 different stages of their lives. So we meet these young boys and we greet them at the end as old men, and they're embroiled in some big events in this world, which is Eastern inspired. And in this world, one of the things that I thought was so cleverly done by Abraham is he's able to bring to life the type of communication that is high context by giving you different poses. For instance, I give you a pose of thanks for watching this video. And he writes that into the text really, really well so that you're not laden with dialogue, and it becomes a pretty efficient style of storytelling. But the characterization is some of the best in the genre, especially as you consider, as you progress through these 4 books, the big things that happen to these characters, and not just the 2 main characters, but some meaningful side characters that permeate the series. When you reflect upon the things that happened to them in previous installments and you see how it shapes them, it's such an incredibly well done bit of characterization in this series. Additionally, I've never read anything else that demonstrated kind of the toll of magic so well. The magic in this world is one of the most inventive things that I've read in the fantasy genre. I found it immediately intriguing all the way throughout, and it really shows that there's a cost, there's a toll to using magic, and I thought it was just done so beautifully in this series. Long Price Quartet is probably the one on this list that the least amount of people have known or read, and I would highly encourage you to pick it up if any of that sounds interesting to you. Number 6 is A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin. Oh, but wait! Didn't you say that if a series isn't done that it wouldn't be on this list? That's not what I said. What I said at the beginning of this video was, I guess we could roll the tape, but that'd be too much editing. If we rolled the tape, what you would know is I said very deliberately, if an author is still writing the series, they go into the honorable mention pile. And I don't believe that Martin is still writing the series. So, because of that, based on 5 books, it's still in my top 6. This is a series, though, if I'm wrong about that, and he actually is writing, and he does complete this series, it could go all the way to the top. This is some of the best fantasy storytelling you're going to get. What's remarkable for me about A Song of Ice and Fire is how well it does so many different things. It gives you some of the greatest characters in the genre. It gives you some of the greatest character arcs in the genre. It gives you some of the best world building in the genre. It gives you some of the best action sequences in the genre. It gives you some of the best political fantasy in the genre. And it definitely gives you some of the biggest shocks that you will read in the genre. I'm putting it number 6. The end of the 5th book, kind of hated it. One of my favorite characters was killed, and that's where we're left. So I'm left in my mind kind of the end of the television show. But if he does come back, maybe I'm wrong here. I have no doubt that this series will raise, and it'll crack the top 5, maybe the top 3, maybe number 1. You never know. But A Song of Ice and Fire, if it's done right now, which I think it is. I think if I'm being optimistic, we might get Winds of Winter, but A Dream of Spring is exactly that. It's a dream. We're never going to get that final book unless somebody else writes it. So with that in mind, just 5 books in, A Song of Ice and Fire is definitely a top 10 favorite for me. Number 5 is The Dark Tower by Stephen King. This is the book series that took the longest of any of these to complete, 1982 to 2005. It's a 7-book series, and it is a series that, although this is a fantasy list, is a mashup of just about any genre you can imagine, because King just defies genre in this series, and he's willing to go places that frankly other authors couldn't do because they'd probably be overruled by their publishers. The story starts out like a Western. You get horror elements, you get science fiction elements, there's kind of militaristic elements in the middle, obviously fantastical elements, magical realism, and even metafiction at the end. And there are things in here that land really well and some things that don't. It's kind of a sloppy series, to be honest. There are things that are quite remarkable. But what is the most remarkable for me is just the fearless storytelling and the way that King unfolds this story. And this is a story that starts with the very famous, memorable line, "The man in black fled across the desert and the gunslinger followed." it sucked me in right away and kept me all the way to the end of the series. And the end of this series is, in my opinion, one of the finest conclusions to a book series that I've read. Not everybody agrees with me. More people agree now than when it first came out. I remember when it first came out, I loved the ending, and so many people hated the ending, and they've kind of come to the light and come to understand that the ending is fantastic, because what it does is it causes you to really think about the Dark Tower. But it is fearless storytelling. If you've never read it, realize The Gunslinger is very short, and it's kind of a book that people bounce off of. Give it 2 books before you commit to maybe jumping off the series, but I think it's some of the best storytelling out there. I think when you add up all of these genres together, it is a work of fantasy, and it is one of my top 5 works of fantasy. Number 4 is The First Law by Joe Abercrombie. So The First Law is technically a trilogy, followed by 3 standalone novels, followed by a sequel trilogy. But I saw an interview with Abercrombie, and he said he secretly wrote a 9-book epic. And that's how I consider it, because you get character arcs that begin in the first trilogy but don't end there. You get character arcs that begin in the standalones and end in the sequel trilogy. And it's really important you need to read all 9 of them. And what I really love about Abercrombie is not the grimdark elements. That's what most people talk about him. He's known as Lord Grimdark, and he's kind of embraced that moniker. But for me, there's 2 things that really stand out for Abercrombie. One is the characters, which everybody talks about the characters. I made a character list a while back. I was going to do a video of my top 10 favorite fantasy characters, and I was going to just limit it to 1 per author. Couldn't do that with Abercrombie. Absolutely not. How do you leave off Glock to Anne Logan Nine Fingers? And several others. So he's a great character writer. But for me, what's greatest about The First Law is its trope subversion. If you just think, those of you that read it, the first time that you see magic used, you realize, oh, this is not my grandfather's fantasy. This is not in the Tolkien vein. The second book unfolds like a typical fantasy story and goes a totally different direction. And Abercrombie tells you, yeah, this is what I'm all about. I'm going to subvert your expectations throughout the entire series. And so much of it is driven by character. A lot has been said about his ear for dialogue, which I don't need to repeat that because it's true. I also love the stylized prose in his stories. It's a different kind of storytelling, although I typically just enjoy kind of the more antiquated, kind of Tolkien-esque kind of prose style. With Abercrombie, because he's so good at it, it just works for me. And I really enjoy kind of the stylized, more modern kind of punchy dialogue and shorter chapters and things like that. And it just works really, really well for me. First Law is one of my favorite works of modern fantasy. And I just adore the series and can't wait to reread it at some point in the future. Number 3 is The Sarantine Mosaic by Guy Gavriel Kay. Guy Gavriel Kay has become my favorite author, and he writes mostly standalones. And The Sarantine Mosaic is one of his 2 series, and it's just a duology, and it's really one story broken up into 2 novels. A lot of people might push back that this is not technically fantasy, because he's often known as historical fiction with a quarter turn to the fantastical, but it's fantasy. There are magical creatures in here, there are magical things that go on. There's enough in here that it is fantasy. Even if it is steeped in Earth's past, it's basically a series that's based off of a time in the Byzantine Empire. Names change to the Sarantine Empire, and it's a big event that's happening in these 2 books. But the genius of Kay in this series is that he doesn't tell you the story like a typical fantasy story or even a typical historical fiction story. He doesn't give you the point of views all the time of like the emperor or the generals or the opposing factions. You get point of views from main characters and artisan. He's a mosaicist. You get point of views from dancers and doctors and cooks and assistant cooks and chariot racers. And it's such an inventive way to tell a story from the perspective of characters that the history books won't remember, but they're there and they're very important. The thing I love about Kay in this series and the books that I consider peak Guy Gavriel Kay is this strong narrative voice. In The Sarantine Mosaic, it's from an historic lens because it's telling you this important story. granted from the point of view of smaller characters, but it just adds a weight, it adds a gravitas to the story that when I'm reading the best of K, like the Sarantine Mosaic, it makes me feel like what I'm reading is important. And there's very few works of literature that when I read it, I feel like this is really important. The Sarantine Mosaic, for me, is a really important text. Number 2 is The Realm of the Elderlings by Robin Hobb. Realm of the Elderlings is consisted of 5 different sub-series, which makes this 16-book series a little easier to read because you can read each sub-series and then take a little break before you get to the next one. It begins with the Farseer trilogy, followed up by the Live Ship Traders trilogy, the Tawny Man trilogy, the Rainwild Chronicles, which is 4 books, and it finishes with the Fitz and Fool trilogy. And this is one of the greatest literary journeys I've taken. The first, third, and fifth series of this Realm of the Elderlings follows one character in a first-person narrative, and you meet Fitz Chivalry Farseer as a young boy in book 1, and you progress all the way to seeing him as an old man in the final book of the series. And the series between kind of the Fitz series fill out the world building quite a bit and just let you know more of what's going on in the bigger picture rather than in just Fitz's story, even though Fitz's story is so important. Hobb is, above all, perhaps the greatest character writer the fantasy genre has seen. She also has one of my favorite prose styles, just really, really rich, not super dense or super flowery, but just perfect word choices. And what Hobb does with her character work through her prose is she causes you to connect and really understand character dynamics, character relationships in a way that I haven't read anywhere. And I think that's her greatest skill, is that she connects you to these characters, and when something happens, you feel it. These are not books for the faint of heart. You know, people will talk about Abercrombie or some others being grimdark. There's some really dark things in these books that are going to make you hurt. And Hobb makes you hurt probably more than anybody else that I've read, but in a good way, because there's often catharsis behind it. The Realm of the Elderlings is the book series that really, for the first time, made me think that perhaps going forward as a reader, I can find new favorite things. Because it was the first time in my life that I said, this is my favorite book series above Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. So why is it number 2? Because number 1 is The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. So my favorite book series is still The Realm of the Elderlings, but my favorite fantasy series is The Lord of the Rings. Let me try to explain, because that makes no sense probably. When I think of my favorite book series, Realm of the Elderlings pops in my mind, but when I think of the fantasy genre in particular, Tolkien comes first. He pops into my head right away. When I think of fantasy, I think of Tolkien. He's the one that kind of set the stage for this genre. He's the one that for decades, a vast majority of authors were just trying to follow what he did rather than go different directions. Publishers didn't want to publish things that were not like him. He is the grandfather of this genre. He's the most important author this genre has ever seen. So for me, I think he'll always be number 1 on a list like this for me. He created all the tropes that we love. He created the tropes that we love to subvert in modern fantasy. And to this day still has, to me, the greatest world that's been created in this genre. There are bigger worlds, but I don't know if there are worlds with more depth than what Tolkien did. I have a whole row of Tolkien literature up here, and you see that he did all of this. He wrote thousands of pages of things to tell you 2 stories. He told you The Hobbit, he told you The Lord of the Rings. And that depth just shines through in the stories. I'm always going to be a huge Tolkien fan, and I admit that some of it may be a little bit nostalgic. I do know modern readers that don't love Tolkien, but I've reread it twice now, and every time I get something more out of it, and every time I just think, yeah, this is still the fantasy genre. So for me, my number 1 favorite fantasy series is The Lord of the Rings, because Tolkien is fantasy. So hey, that's my top 10 list. I would love to hear what's on your top 10 list. I especially want to hear things that aren't on my list that perhaps I haven't read, because you can maybe help me prioritize things. If I hear people talking about a lot of the big series that aren't on my top 10. Like, I've read some Discworld, haven't finished it yet. Haven't read enough for it to make an honorable mention. That's probably one people will talk about. People will probably talk about the Book of the New Sun. People may talk about Narnia. That just left off on my list a little bit, but I would love to hear your favorite fantasy series. It was fun for me to talk about mine. Now let's talk about yours in the comments section. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. You can also find me on Twitter, Goodreads, and the Fireside Discord. I'd love to interact with you there. As always, thank you for watching. Until next time, goodbye.